Hiya! Welcome to Darren in the studio. Thanks for swinging by for another video. Before we go any further, just want to thank everybody for all their subscriptions, their likes, their comments, all that kind of thing. You know, we love it here in the studio when you sort of get involved and tell us what you think. Give us your views and comments. You know where to leave them. Leave them in the comment section. And I promise I do my very, very best to reply to some and like them and read them, certainly read them. If you haven't subscribed, then please do so. It's absolutely free to subscribe. Just hit the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications and like the video, all that kind of stuff. It really helps the channel. It's absolutely free and it just helps the channel move along just a little bit. What are we talking about this time round? Well, this time I thought we would celebrate 50 years. We're looking at 1973 albums that came out in 1973. Albums that came out in 1973 that I personally have in my collection. Now, there'll be albums that you'll have that came out in 1973 that won't be featured in this particular video. These are a selection of albums that I've chosen that came out in 1973. So these are albums that are celebrating the 50-year anniversary. A lot of these albums have been reissued with sort of extra tracks in sort of deluxe packaging, box sets, all those kind of things. But these are the versions that are in my collection. Most of them are on vinyl. There's a couple of CDs in there. Okay, so let's have a look at 1973. Before we go any further, you're probably wondering why I'm wearing Casablanca Records. Well, Casablanca Records was formed in 1973. Of course, their first album release was the first Kiss album in early 1974. So 1973, all these albums are in alphabetical order. The first one I've got is this: Black Sabbath, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. This is an original pressing from 1973. Nice little gatefold. That's right. I should have took it out the sleeve first. That's our first album from 1973, Black Sabbath's Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. This album was actually produced by Black Sabbath as well. This artwork that's featured on here is really sort of dark and mysterious and scary, really. I mean, pretty sort of desperate stuff. Kind of horror movie kind of looks. Black Sabbath, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. Next up, Mark Bolin and TRex, the 1973 album Tanks. This is a 90s repressing, this one. Mark on Wax, which was the company that was formed to put out Mark Bolin's material, reissued the album on Mark on Wax. Like I say, this is a 1990s repressing. It doesn't actually say when it was repressed, but it's on the Mark on Wax label. Quick show of the label, because the label's really nice. Nice little illustration of Mark on there. Of course, they're constantly reissuing Mark's material these days, and I think there's a box set out at the moment called 1973. But there you go, Mark Bolin, TRex, Tanks. The hit that was on here is Born to Boogie, but there's some great tracks on here. Tenement Lady's a great song. Mad Donna is on here. Left Hand Luke. TRex, Mark Bolin and TRex, Tanks. Next album from 1973. This is a real classic, and you'll know this one for sure. Lots of you will have this album. David Bowie, It's Aladdin Sane. This is an 80s repress because Aladdin Sane originally came out as a gatefold, but this isn't. This is just a standard German 80s repress. I don't think it says the year it was actually repressed. Printed and manufactured in West Germany. Sleeve 1981, but that would have been the single sleeve version. I think this is like possibly like a late 90s press, something like that. Late 80s, mid 90s, early 90s. David Bowie, Aladdin Sane. Next up, from 1973, talking of Casablanca Records, bit of a connection here. As you guys know, I am a massive Kiss fan, but I can't really include anything from 1973 regarding Kiss, because of course their first album was 1974. But the first time that Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley ever appeared officially on an official release was this. This is a lady called Lynn Christopher. This is on the EMI label. This is Lynn Christopher's album. It's just called Lynn Christopher. And this is the first time that Gene and Paul were ever featured officially on an album. Of course, they had the Wicked Lester material, but that was never officially released. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley are credited on here as backing vocals. Background vocals, Margaret Dawn, Linda Lowley, Sharon Redd, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley. 1973, Lynn Christopher on the EMI label. If you want to get a copy of this, you will have to stump up some serious bucks. You really will. This album goes for a pretty penny, and this is a beautiful UK pressing. Nice little, I'll show you the label. Like I say, if you want to get this, it's going to cost you a little bit of money. The first time that Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley from Kiss were ever featured officially on a release. 1973, Lynn Christopher. Next up, from 1973, this is a real classic. The first of two albums that this band had out in 1973. It's Alice Cooper and the $1 Billion Babies album. This is probably the most famous Alice Cooper band album. 1973, this is, well, how many classics do you need? Hello, Hooray, Elected, $1 Billion Babies, No More Mr. Nice Guy, Generation Landslide, I Love the Dead, and others. This is a real classic. For those of you that haven't seen my top 10 favourite Alice Cooper albums, then check out that video as well. This album is definitely featured in those 10. This is also an 80s repress, actually 1979 version of this. This album now comes out in various sort of forms. I have got the $1 Billion in here somewhere. There it is. But you can get the one where you can punch out the these cards, and this has got a little slit in it for the $1 Billion, but this hasn't. This is just a basic late 90s, early 80s repress on the Warner Brothers label. Alice Cooper, $1 Billion Babies. Their second album of 1973 was this one. This is one of my favourite album covers. I'm sorry, but I did put a little bit of sellotape on here. I've had this a long time. I bought this when I was a kid. 1973, Alice Cooper's second album from that year. It's Muscle of Love. I love this packaging. You just don't get this kind of thing anymore. I think on the reissue of this album, they did make it look like this. You got a nice little poster inside. Also, the record itself came in this nice little picture in a sleeve, and the label is on the green Burbank Warner Brothers label. This camera, I've noticed watching other videos that I've done, really picks up the dust and the dirt, and unfortunately we do live in quite a dusty house. Alice Cooper's second album of 1973, Muscle of Love. Although it says here, class of 74, it says there. This album actually came out in 1973. If I get that back in there. Yeah, Alice Cooper, 1973. It says on the back, 1973. Next, from 1973, Peter Frampton. This is an album called Something's Happening. Peter Frampton, 1973. I'm not really familiar that much with this album. I was actually gifted this record along with a ton of other ones. Some I've kept and some I haven't. But I thought this was a nice little album. Peter Frampton, Something's Happening. I'm not sure whether this was the first of his work. Nice little album on the A&M label. Peter Frampton's Something's Happening. Like I say, got given a ton of records probably, well, I don't know, about a year or so ago, and this was in there. Peter Frampton, 1973. Next up from 1973, one of my favourite albums that I have in my collection, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road from Elton John. This is an absolute classic. I love this album. Again, this is an 80s repress, because this came out as like a triple sort of gatefold, double album, triple gatefold. But this is the double. This is the normal gatefold version with the first inner sleeve with the other illustrations on it. And of course, this album just runs through all the classics. Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding, Candle in the Wind, Benny and the Jets, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Grey Seals, one of my favourite tracks on this album. Sweet Painted Lady is beautiful. It's just an album full of classics. Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting, 1973, Elton John, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Next up from 1973, Steve Miller Band, The Joker. This is a beautiful album cover and a great album as well. Nice little gatefold sleeve. Steve Miller Band, The Joker, 1973. Again, this is an original on the EMI label. EMI Capital. So I don't know what the significance of that is. On Capital label there, get it the right way around, Aaron. Is that the right way around? No, that's upside down. I take it Capital and EMI were the same sort of thing here in the UK. I think this is a UK press, but it does say Capital EMI on it. Steve Miller Band, The Joker. Next up from 1973, a real classic. How about this? Mike Oldfield, Tubular Bells. This is an original 1973 press that I found in a second-hand record shop and didn't pay very much for it. It was an album I always wanted, and it was an album that I wanted as an original, and there's the original Virgin label. Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, 1973, of course, celebrating 50 years of this album being out. I think this album's just recently had a 50-year anniversary reissue. Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, possibly the most iconic album of 1973 next. And what can you say about this? It's an absolute belter. It's a classic. It's Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. This is one of the reissues that came out in the 2000s, I think. 2016, I think that says. Obviously, originally released March 1973. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. And of course, this album it's just a classic from start to finish. On the Run, Speak to Me, On the Run, Breathe, In the Air, Time, Great Gig in the Sky, Money, Us and Them. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Next up from 1973, Elvis and his Separate Ways album. This was one of those albums. Elvis albums in the 70s were just, how can I put this? Not very good. The record company RCA Victor they didn't really respect Elvis's career, I don't think. What would happen is he would have a single, and the single from this was always on my mind. So they would put out a single and the B-side would be featured on the album as well. But the rest of the album, this is just full of sort of movie tracks, other album tracks from years and years ago. So there was nothing really new on this. Separate Ways was new. Always on My Mind was new. But apart from that, the rest of the material, I think, is pretty much old stuff. And it's a shame, really, because they could have done so much better. The cover's a little bit tacky as well, isn't it? I'm after a better press of this. This is on the RCA Camden label, which was like the budget label of RCA Records that we all got here in the UK. Elvis, Separate Ways. I'm not sure whether there was another Elvis album in 1973, but this is definitely 1973. Another band who had their first album in 1973, or a band that had their first album in 1973, would be Queen. And here it is. This is my copy. Got a little bit of damage here. That's why I've got my hand over it. This is an interesting copy of Queen's debut album. This is on the Fame EMI label. A nice little sort of late 80s repress. These albums actually are quite collectible now, because fans, especially overseas in sort of like the States and stuff, they like these little variations on the Fame EMI label. Also Fame, a few albums on the Capitol label, like Wasp and stuff like that. They were reissued in the late 80s, early 90s on the Fame EMI label. This is Queen's first album. Again, this has got some real good stuff on it. Keep Yourself Alive, Doing All Right, Great King Rat's one of my favourite. The Night Comes Down, Modern Times Rock and Roll, really good rocker from Roger Taylor. Queen, the first album, 1973. Next up from 1973, you'll know I've talked about this guy quite a lot on the channel and intend to do more. This is Jim Reeves. Now, of course, Jim Reeves died in a plane crash in 1964, but Jim was a prolific demo recorder, which meant that when he died, they had tons of material to release. And what they used to do is they used to take off the backing tracks of his original demos, put a whole new backing on, and for years and years and years, right into the 80s, Jim Reeves was putting out new material, stuff that people had never heard before. And this is one of those albums from 1973 with material on it. Some of it was already released, but what they did is they got all the songs, took off the original backings from probably the late 50s, early 60s, and put whole new backings on, and that's what they used to do. This is a nice little album from the States, originally $3.25. Jim Reeves. This album's called Am I That Easy to Forget? It's got that song on it. Welcome to My World's on here. Deep Dark Water. The Search Has Ended. Heartbreak in Silhouette. Like I say, a lot of these songs will have never been released at this particular time in 1973. Again, on the RCA Victor label. Nice little original Jim Reeves. 1973. Couple of albums which are the same. I've only got this on CD though. The Rolling Stones, Goat's Head Soup was released in 1973. This is the original CD release of it. But I also have the reissue that came out in the 2000s, I think. This is 2009. Goat's Head Soup at the Rolling Stones. This is a better version of it. One, because it's been remastered better, and also the inner sleeve is much better. The booklet's got some of the original pictures which were featured on the album when it first came out, whereas this version hasn't. This is a much better version of it. Goat's Head Soup, the Rolling Stones, 1973, bit of a classic for them. This one, Billy Preston appears on this, on piano, keyboards. Rolling Stones, Goat's Head Soup, 1973. Also from 1973, here's another classic. We're talking Status Quo, The Quo. This is the Hello album. This is a nice little original as well. It's got some scuff marks on the sleeve, but the vinyl itself plays lovely. Roll Over, Lay Down, Blue Eyed Lady, Caroline, 4,500 Times. They're just 4 of the classics that are on this album. Status Quo, Hello. Also from 1973, Traffic. This is a nice little original pressing, which has the cutout sleeve. This is on the Island label. Traffic, this album is called Shoot Out at Fantasy Factory. Traffic 1973, of course, featuring Steve Winwood. Also from 1973, last but not least, and I've only got this one on CD, it's ZZ Top's Tres Hombre album. This CD is part of the box set of the original albums. Tres Hombre, ZZ Top, a lot of classics on here. Waiting for the Bus, Jesus Just Left Chicago, Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers. What else is on here? LaGrange is on here. ZZ Top, Tres Hombre from 1973. That's about it. Thanks for tuning our way. Thanks for swinging in for another video. Hopefully you'll hit the subscribe button. Do check out all the other videos on the channel, and hopefully we'll get to do another video for you very, very soon. Until that time, look after yourselves, look after each other, and I'll see you for another video soon here in the studio. Ta-da.